Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sandeep Ray, and we are talking about the book. Today we have with us Associate Professor of History at NUS, Timothy Barnard, and we will be discussing this new book, Imperial Creatures. Now, to start off with, there is some good news. This book has just been shortlisted for the Nonfiction Prize for the Singapore Book Publishers Association. Congratulations, Prof.
Well, thank you, Sandeep. And I'm glad to be here to chat about the book with you.
Okay. Now, we know a little bit about you because you are from this region you've been here for so many years. You've been teaching at NUS for 21 years. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Right. And your earlier work was about polity in the Malay world. And then you worked quite substantially on film in this region, right? Sort of older historical films. Last decade or so, you've moved on to ecology and the environment. This is your second monograph. There's another one coming up. And of course, you've worked with many authors from here, and you've put together this book called Nature Contained. This is a substantial body of work. So the first question, general one, I guess, is why this shift to nature and ecology?
Well, I became interested in both the geographic space of Singapore and environmental approaches due to the different classes I've taught at the National University here, in which I became familiar with the archival sources, what is available to study Singaporean history. And even back when I was a graduate student, I was studying a lot about the environment, and these different threads came together over the last decade or so and has manifested itself in the publications related to the history of the Singaporean environment.
Okay. Now, let's situate ourselves in July. We've just come out of the circuit breaker, or as the lockdown is called in Singapore. And even in that short period of time, we saw how things could get overgrown very quickly. We saw how, the otters were eating the koi fish, etc. There were these stories about nature kind of creeping in. Now, when you think about that, if you think about the reverse for a minute, what did it take to tame the entire island of Singapore? And when did that process begin? And what started all of this?
Well, in many respects, it began with the arrival of the East India Company in 1819. When they arrived, there was already a few pepper and gambier plantations near the Padang, but it grew in exponential power over the colonial period. Within 50 years, Singapore became deforested. 92% of the landscape of the timber resources were cut down, replaced with grasses. And this had implications that I discussed in the book to also the animal life on the island. Without the forests, there was limited access to a home base, a habitat for these animals. And so it transformed animal life here in Singapore, and also the floral cover here in Singapore. And so due to imperialism, you had active development of plantations that grew monocrops, or at best 2 or 3 crops, and that simply simplified the landscape. The landscape was tamed and shaped to fit the needs of imperialism. And so the thing is, over the last couple of months, we talk about, there's been a regrowth of the plants, or on the medians of the highways, they weren't trimmed as much. Animals felt a little bit freer to wander the landscape, as the otters famously did. And that was simply because of an absence of human intervention. With the arrival of human intervention due to imperialism, it had, in many respects, the reverse case. We've seen just a minor blip in this in the last 3 or 4 months. Now imagine decades and decades of active deforestation and active transformation of the landscape to create agricultural lands. That changed Singapore tremendously.
Right. But there is, if I remember in the book, there is one little paradox, which is it was this act of some degree of deforestation that brought tigers to Singapore for the first time.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. As part of the process of deforestation, what is of interest is they created actually a excellent habitat in which tigers could thrive, because tigers like to live on the edges of disturbed forest, because in true primary forest you have a canopy, and in the canopy it is or on the ground it is difficult for animals to survive because there's not a lot of food resources for them.
How did the tigers get here?
They swam over from the Malaysian peninsula, from Johor. But what they do is they like to live on the edge of this disturbed forest, and that's where deer or wild boar or other animals live that they could then capture and kill.
Right. So these tigers swam over.
They swam over from Johor, established themselves here on the edge of this disturbed forest as plantations spread. Okay. And they became a serious problem in Singapore in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, when this deforestation was taking place.
Right.
Once the deforestation was complete by the 1880s, the tiger issue went into decline simply because their own habitat had been transformed.
Right.
And it was no longer a good place for them to find resources.
Okay. So speaking about animals coming over and creating some problems, etc., one of the, I would say this is almost like a centerpiece of your book, is the issue of dealing with dogs. Now, the recent cover of BiblioAsia, I have an image here on my computer. It's about your book, and it has a picture of a white officer probably going out for a day hunting, and he's got his servant with him. And he's out with his dog, but they are out actually to cull dogs. Now, this is a big part of the story, is culling dogs in a way that we today would kind of be horrified at, the way it was done. But there were certain days in the week and said, we are out to kill dogs. Tell us a little bit about the killing of dogs.
Yeah, dogs are almost a constant presence in much of the book, simply because their story tells a lot about the history of animals in Singapore. And during the early decades of colonial rule, dogs were seen as, they were called a nuisance. And there were actually individuals assigned to kill the dogs in public. The notice that was just up on the screen was one such government notice. And so about every 3 or 4 months, there would be a public announcement that for 3 or 4 days, any dog seen in public could be beaten to death. And this was quite violent activity that would create a lot of consternation in society today if it took place. But it was seen as a need to live in a good urban colonial port, to get rid of these dogs that were a nuisance. The presence of these dogs, however, or dogs in general in society, began to transform as they also transformed into domestic pets. And so as dogs were incorporated into the household, which occurred throughout the 19th century in Singapore, that also had further implications, because how you deal with a dog that's considered a nuisance, that's a stray roaming the society, compared to a beloved domestic pet, reflects also larger changes in the society. So for example, here we have a picture of a woman posing with a dog, and in which that's shown as almost a symbol of modernity. Someone who could take care of a dog, to take care of a domestic pet that had no real utilitarian purpose besides companionship. That reflects a certain amount of prosperity, wealth that someone can display in society. So dogs also became symbols of kind of a well-to-do.
Okay. So there are dogs and there are dogs. Right.
There were dogs and there were dogs, right?
So there were the local dogs that were a menace, and they were being put
Yes.
down, and then these imported, particularly bred in a particular way,
Mhm.
depending on the style at the time, and what
Yes.
looked like a nice society dog was brought
Mhm.
in. Now there's a horror story that comes with this, which is a reveal in the book, which is your research has actually tracked one particular ship that came from
Yes.
England that
Yes.
brought rabies to this island. Can you
That is
tell us a
correct.
little bit more about how this happened and what the fallout for that was?
Well, in 1884, a ship arrived in the harbor, and it had on board well-bred. They were at least described as well-bred pets from London, and these pets were basically terriers and poodles and such. They were taken to Raffles Place and auctioned off. The people that bought them were the elite of society because they were hoping to buy a symbol of their own place in the society. And so these people that brought home poodles and terriers were hoping to display their own status. There was a problem, however, because in April 1884, the dogs that were on the ship actually had rabies. And this was how rabies was introduced to Singapore. And in the next decade, it spread throughout the society, and it created a tremendous amount of anxiety, stress, and then also reactions on behalf of the government and the people on how they were going to deal with this issue. And the real problem was rabies, this terrible disease that turned humans into animals, was coming from their high class, well bred, domesticated pets. It was not coming from the dog nuisance, from the stray dogs that roam the streets that people would traditionally blame for any issue or problems in the society. And so now it came from the elite and their own desire for status.
Okay. Now I'm going to get personal for a minute.
Mhm.
It seems to me that this problem originated from these dogs that came from England, right?
Yes, it did. Yes, it did.
This was a big deal for a long time, and then
Mhm.
it was gradually worked through, but
Mhm.
various ordinances and a lot of killings. Now,
Yes.
fairly recently, we moved from Jakarta, and we brought our dog with us, and the dog had to be quarantined in nice conditions. I'll say that, for
Mhm.
an entire month before
Correct.
she was let to come live with us. Now, if this is a problem that came from a colonial origin,
Mhm.
why does a Southeast Asian creature coming into Singapore, a pet, have to go
Mhm.
through this amount of rigor in 2019? Well, it's still the way things
2019,
are.
2020.
Yeah.
Well, the simple answer to that is because there's rabies still in Indonesia. And so there's a fear of that. But these regulations, such as quarantine, various, I'm sure you also had to have a lot of certification and proof when you brought the dog in. This all began in the 1880s as a response to that initial rabies outbreak. For example, the registration of dogs became required. So you had to claim ownership of a dog. Uh, Dogs had to wear a collar and then also a metal tag around the neck so that it could be identified. There was also the development of quarantining. But in the 1890s, it was illegal to import a dog for over a decade into Singapore. And only when, around the year 1900, when they were allowed back in, they had to go through this same quarantining procedure. At that time, it was in St. John's Island.
Right.
Now I believe it's out in Sembawang somewhere where they keep the dogs. But the point is, these were rules and regulations developed during the imperial era that are still in practice today.
Okay. Now let's move away from dogs for a moment, because your book covers a lot of issues.
Mhm.
It looks at the diversity,
Mhm.
the proliferation of many different kinds of creatures that started coming to Singapore. Now, they didn't all necessarily come and stay in the island. It was sort of a point where you came in, there was trading, and then they might have left the island. This has gone on for a long time. There's a Channel News Asia report recently. Pangolin trading $60 million. We're not saying someone, with a container with a dozen pangolins. I mean, at that scale. But this isn't news for Singapore. This has gone on for a long time. Your book has a story about a man named William Basapa, who had his own exotic animal zoo that might have rivaled the Sultan of Johor Zoo. Tell us about the diversity of animals in Singapore and the fascination with that, and why Singapore? Why Singapore? It's a small
Right.
country.
Singapore was just as today, it is a trading hub. It is an important port for global trade. This was also true in the colonial past. And being such an important port, it was a gathering place for exotic animals. People on ships would have their own, perhaps if they had gone to Indonesia, seamen would come in here, sailors would come in with animals ranging from orangutans to birds of paradise to any type of animal. And then they would try to sell it. And so therefore there were people who collected animals and resold them for zoos and circuses in the West, or Australia, Japan, Europe, living in Singapore. And these men, one of the most famous ones was Frank Buck. William Basapa was another example. They would keep the animals here and then sell them or trade them and move them on. Now, Basapa himself eventually developed a zoo in Punggol, but I don't know if it was really I would classify it as a zoo. It was really just a station in which he kept the animals before they moved on. He had a few pets that he kept for himself. He had a famous pet tiger named Ape, and Ape was there constantly. But other animals were part of an exchange system in which he would sell them to, for example, Australian zoos or zoos in America, or he would take animals from America brought here, send it to Australia, and vice versa. And while they were in transit, they may stay at the zoo in Punggol, and people would pay to go visit them. It was one example of a zoo. There was an earlier one in the Singapore Botanic Gardens for 30 years. Also in Singapore, you could go to a circus to see wild animals, but a lot of that was simply because Singapore was a very important port in which all of these animals could be exchanged and displayed for brief periods of time before they moved on to somewhere else. And this is still evident a bit in the unfortunate trade in endangered species like pangolins that you mentioned earlier. Right. And the scale of that, no pun intended, the scale of that continues to be a bit horrifying, yes.
Right. Now, your book has been nominated for a nonfiction award. We would consider this a book for people studying the region, historians to look at. But it's organized and told in quite a narrative way. It's not the way in which people might consider an academic book to be. It's rich, it has anecdotes, it's got stories, it flows. So a very basic question about all the information in the book, and I'm not challenging you on anything, but the question is just simple. How do you know all this?
Research. You read and research. That helps. But basically, I wanted to tell these stories, these tales, these facts through a particular narrative structure that also harks back to earlier ways of presenting history that has its roots in Malay historiography and more non-traditional Western historiography, in the sense that you learn about a society through stories and tales often based in animals. They expose certain truths. And so my goal was to tell these tales, these stories, these developments around animals, because it can also tell us a lot about imperialism and about the way colonial rule was imposed in Singapore and in larger Southeast Asia. Okay.
So if we look at the breadth of time that you're talking about, 1800s all the way till the turn of the last century, we are about 170 years removed from kind of where the book begins. But if you look at this broad sort of swath of time, are there parallels in the way in which the government reacted to some of the disease issues? because I'm thinking about the muzzling of the dogs. I'm thinking about sending them away to St. John's Island. They stopped, I believe, dogs coming into Singapore for a long amount of time,
Mhm.
and then certain restrictions were held. I mean, of course, the circumstances are completely different, but still, is there a memory or a precedent in the founding of this country that helps us look at and understand what to do today?
Right. Well, currently, of course, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's dealing with a virus in Singapore. And for example, the material in the book about rabies elicited a similar response from the government. There were attempts to isolate it, figure out which community it was developed in, whether it was stray dogs or migrant hybrid dogs. There were requirements related to muzzling of all dogs for a long period. There was no longer importation allowed of dogs. There was active culling practices taking place in which they went out and suspended what many people felt were their personal property rights and such. For example, dog killers would go into compounds and just kill dogs randomly in the early 1890s, all in the name of trying to contain a virus that was in the society. In addition, this was part of a panic that took place, because when you actually look at the numbers of people who caught rabies, it was far less than the numbers that had, for example, other diseases like cholera or tuberculosis or typhus. And currently we're dealing with an outbreak of dengue fever, which is very serious in Singapore. So there are certain parallels. Of course, they're different disease. It's different developments. We live in a different society in the year 2020, but we can see certain echoes and a certain precedent set in the 1880s and 1890s with how the government dealt with a disease that also originated in animals. And in many respects, the animal trade or the movement of creatures and people that came into Singapore.
Right. Okay. Speaking about research and trying to understand what to do, there's a very interesting story which I wouldn't want you to give too much away, but the cover, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this monkey on the cover, and the monkey is actually a research assistant, right? Just give us a hint of how that came about, and don't give too much away, please.
That particular monkey on the cover was actually owned by an Australian soldier. Many people in colonial Singapore kept monkeys as pets. It was one of the more popular pets to own. In the instance you're referring to, and there's the epilogue of the book, deals with monkeys similar to the one pictured on the cover that were collecting research assistants at the Singapore Botanic Gardens. The picture on the screen right now is one in which a family is having its picture taken amongst one of the two troops of macaques that roamed the gardens during the colonial era. There were other monkeys brought in, particularly by the deputy director of the gardens, a man named John Corner. And John Corner trained these monkeys to go up in the canopy of trees to collect fruits and seeds. And he essentially adopted these monkeys as members of his family. They lived at his house. He trained them. He would take them on trips around town. They were important research assistants. And so in many respects, these monkeys that he brought into both his office and home were reflective of how different creatures were very important aspect of imperial rule and colonial rule. They were part of the social life and administrative, governmental, scientific life of people in Singapore at the time.
Okay. We're talking to Prof. Tim Barnard and his new book, Imperial Creatures. But I'm not gonna hog all the time, and we are going to move over to questions that people have for us, because we are live. So we do have a question here. The first question is from Hannah Gomez. I'm just going to read it out. Hey, Tim, I love how your book explores how history is embedded in metaphors about flora and fauna, as opposed to a more factual, state narrative approach. How have indigenous frameworks of history writing influenced you?
Okay, well, I'd like to feel the book is based in fact, and it's based in this, but the basic question of how I approached it, and it's a good one that Hannah just asked, is I begin the book with the story of Singapore attacked by swordfishes, Singapura dilang ortodak, which came from ancient Singapore, pre-colonial Singapore, as a way of showing how animals can work as a metaphor for larger truths about a society. We can tell stories. Now, while that story may not be true, it shows you how you can use such stories to tell us about a society. So what my goal is, or goal was for the rest of the book, was to take such stories and then tell them, make them tales in which they weave through. Every chapter basically begins with a tale that reflects what will be discussed in that chapter. Whether it's about a visit of the Russian Grand Duke, or the development of horse racing in Singapore, or problems that people were having with rats. I want to tell a bit of a tale and then think about and frame it within what does that actually mean about this society. And this is something that goes back to earlier hikayats. Hikayats have a lot of tales that tell us about the Malay past, but they're done in a very inventive way in which it is part of storytelling.
Right. Yes. It's done very well. A lot of stories, symbolisms, and a gradual leading into sort of the fact-based inquiry of the troubles that we went through. Okay. Let's see if there are any other questions from our readers or viewers right now. Okay. Now I just want to add so this is from NUS Press. Sorry, I'm turning it the wrong direction, right? And one of the things that I like about NUS Press, other than their great variety of books, is that they are affordable. They're not like some of those academic books which sell for $100 or $150. The price point is great. But anyone today, if you want to buy this book, you can go, and it's just not for today. If you go to the NUS Press website and use the code Barnard20, Barnard20, like the author's name, then you get an additional 20% off. And I get no kickback, just putting it out there. Okay, actually, another question came in while I was talking about the book, and it's from Chloe Chua. I'm just going to read it out as it is. Hi, Tim and Sandeep. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us this afternoon. My question is for Tim. You mentioned that Imperial Creatures deals predominantly with regular, non-charismatic animals in Singapore, as opposed to the megafauna of tigers and elephants. Because of this focus, and as an undergrad who is approaching her capstone project, I was wondering what resources were the most helpful in your research of these animals in the daily events. Maybe you could share more about your, I'm assuming that means methodology. So, Prof, you're going to put on your mentor professor hat in addition to your author hat right now.
Okay. A good question, Chloe. Basically, what sources did I use, or how did I come upon these materials? And excuse me, the main thing is a lot of it is become available in Singapore through the digitization of archives. I mentioned earlier that a lot of my research over the last decade or so has come out of courses I taught that deal with sources. That's made me more aware of what's available in the archives, in the libraries in Singapore, and the richness of it. And so I often would begin in both looking at governmental records, but also things like newspapers, old travelers' accounts of Singapore, a variety of these things. And from there, you can build on. Once you find a story, let's say rabies in Singapore, there are reports in the government records. But then when you begin to look on travelers' tales, you begin to look in the newspapers, you see more and more. There's rarely an actual government file that will say like dogs or horses or tigers. Those really don't exist. But if you combine all these sources together, you begin to get these tales and stories that come out. And then when you get enough of them, you begin to see the pattern. You begin to see how people are reacting to animals. And so that is one reason the book focuses on non-charismatic animals. In many approaches, when people have dealt with the history of animals in Southeast Asia, they focus on, for example, elephants or orangutans. Robert Cribb did an excellent book along with a couple of other scholars on orangutans. I've done work on Komodo dragons.
All right.
But what is the story of animals in Singapore? While you do have tigers, and they're mentioned in the book, it's really about dogs and horses and cats and birds and pigs. Animals you wouldn't necessarily put a spotlight on, but they're in the sources. You just have to sift through them and look at them. I hope that was a little long answer, but I hope that helps.
Okay, but I can I just follow up for a second?
Sure.
Our sense of historian doing research is you go to an archive and you pull down documents, and you have maybe a flask of coffee which you very carefully keep on one side, and you sneak in and you spend hours and hours and you literally look through things. Now we do know now that some things have changed because of the access to the internet, and also in this environment right now, we're not really going to public spaces and archives and libraries so much. A lot of our work has to happen right at our desks. So
Yes.
for a student who's listening, or anyone who's interested in these topics, or any topic really, what are the portals that are available in Singapore for someone to start doing this work?
No, absolutely. Good point. A lot of the research for this book was done simply in the room you're looking at right now, at the desk, in the sense that the National Library has a vast range of resources. There's a newspapers.sg archive that basically has all newspapers online, and you can kind of search through them using key terms. The National Archives has a very strong digitization project. I mean, sure, we would like many other items to come online, but they do have a lot of material that you can access online. You can also write them. They're very kind people. They will help you and assist you in your search. And so I would say simply go to the National Library website, the National Archives website of Singapore, and there's a vast array of material that you can access that would help anyone interested in conducting research on Singaporean history.
Okay, Prof, we've taken up a lot of your time and we're running out of our time here, but there's one more question and I think we should take it. It's from Andrew Breeson. I hope I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. Hi, Tim and Sandeep. Is there anything we can learn from Singapore's experience of dealing with rabies that we can use today? I think you touched on this, but let me perhaps elaborate on this a bit. Yeah.
Sure. Well, what's interesting to me when dealing with rabies and the introduction of rabies to Singapore was how society reacted. Initially, the elite or the government could not believe that it was rooted or came from their own pets. It could never be their fault. It had to be those stray dogs that were roaming through Singapore. So for the first year or so, there was a lot of finger pointing at the stray dogs, the common dogs that were roaming around on the streets here, and not the precious domestic pets that were in elite households. Once this realization occurred, the government then took very strict measures. That's why they did things such as the registration of dogs, the muzzling of dogs that were kept in the household. They also tried to limit the number of dogs that were in a household to hopefully 2, unless you could prove there was some other reason for you to have more than 2 dogs. And so what you learned at that time was be careful of who they're pointing fingers at, but it's also a very dynamic process. How the authorities react to certain issues shifts and change as they learn and begin to realize what's going on. A good example would be earlier in COVID-19 here, we were told not to wear masks. reserve them for medical workers, and that was a good idea at the time. But as we learned more and more about COVID-19, mask wearing became more of a important issue. And of course, we should all wear masks when we go outside now until we can find a vaccine. And so the thing is, my main larger point with regard to rabies is to realize how dynamic decision making is going on, how they place blame on certain groups, and then how they react to it through certain restrictions, monitoring, controls of the infected population.
Okay. Prof, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you that last question.
Oh, okay.
So it takes years to write a book like this, and you've had a book launch, which I had the good fortune to attend a few months ago. There have been great reviews in the newspapers, in the Straits Times. You're nominated for this award. What's next?
The book I'm working on right now is about water, the development of water resources in Singapore, drinking water from the 1819 to present. The basic question in the book is, where did you get a glass of water to drink? From a well, from a reservoir, from pipes in from Johor. It's shifted and changed over time. And as it shifted and changed, it reflects new realities and programs and society itself in Singapore. In addition, I'm working on a edited book, which would be a continuation of Imperial Creatures, called Singaporean Creatures, which will be a collection of essays about animals in Singapore since 1942, written by both myself and other scholars interested in the topic.
Okay. Thank you so much for giving us a good chunk of your Monday afternoon. We wish you all the best for your research to come, and we look forward to reading more of your books. We've been talking about Imperial Creatures and talking about the book with Prof. Tim Barnard. And for anyone who's tuned in, thank you for listening. I think the video will stay online for a while if you want to send it out to people so people can know a little bit more about the book. Prof, thank you. And we thank NUS Press for hosting the event.
Yeah, thank you.